This lecture is intended to give you enough information to be able to complete the Evaluate Psychological Claims project. So after you watch this, go to the assignment link. You'll see a handout. If you haven't done it already, you'll see a handout that actually describes the assignment. In case you haven't seen it yet, give you a brief idea. You're going to find a website that makes some claims about psychology, and then you're going to apply the 7 tips that I tell you about in this lecture to come to a decision about whether or not that website appears to be credible or not. Okay, so with that in mind, this is the assignment that's most closely associated with the idea of critical thinking. You might remember back in the beginning of the semester, I defined critical thinking as thinking like a scientist in your everyday life. Today, I'm actually going to give you a semi-specific list of skills that are involved in critical thinking. But before I do that, I want to ask you to think about the answers to 2 questions, right? So imagine that we were doing this face-to-face. I would ask the class, would you agree that many, if not most, of your previous teachers or current teachers have considered critical thinking an important course objective or an important goal to try to achieve? And as you can imagine, I overwhelmingly get people to say yes, right? Yeah. Most of your teachers think that critical thinking is important. Second question, why? And imagine the sound of crickets chirping. I mean, some students will come up with some pretty reasonable answers, but in essence, they're thinking of them on their own, right? Because I think what largely happens is we as teachers, we sort of think it's self-evident why critical thinking is important. Well, of course it's important. It's critical thinking. But we don't actually go to the trouble of saying, hey, well, what's the benefit? You know, why should you go to the trouble of improving your critical thinking skills? Right? For me, it comes down to one very, very simple fact. And it's actually probably something that I had mentioned at one time or another during the semester. I like to be right. Right? Do you like to be right? I do. I hate to be wrong. Because I like to be right, I'm going to learn critical thinking. Because that's what it's intended to do. Right? Critical thinking is a set of thinking skills that are specifically designed for you to be right, for you to believe in the things that are true and to disbelieve in the things that are false, to be able to tell sense from nonsense. I like that. I want to do that. I like to be right. So I'm going to learn to be a critical thinker. I guess I'll put all 3 sets up here. So here's my list of semi-specific skills. Now, it turns out, as you might guess from looking at this is a huge list. It's very, very broad. We do not have the opportunity, we do not have the time to cover all of these. And so the assignment itself is really going to be focusing on the 3rd set. All right. So let's just briefly talk about the first 2. First, reasoning and problem-solving skills. Right? An entire semester's worth of material right there. But it turns out reasoning, logical reasoning, good inductive and deductive reasoning skills are very, very difficult. Okay? Problem-solving, unfortunately there is no NOBA module on problem-solving, so we haven't covered that at all, but realize there are some really serious problems that people have when they try and solve problems. And so just keep that in the background. If you want to be a good critical thinker, you want to bone up on your reasoning skills and your problem-solving skills. Second, skepticism. Skepticism is probably the individual skill that appears the most in different definitions of critical thinking. Skepticism is a word that some people, when they use it, they misuse it. And the way that you can tell that somebody's misusing it is if they intend it as an insult. They say, oh, that person's a skeptic. He doesn't believe anything. That's not what being a skeptic is. Right? If somebody calls you a skeptic and they're using it correctly, you should thank them because they're paying you a very, very high intellectual compliment. Right? A skeptic is somebody who waits to form an opinion until sufficient evidence has been provided for that opinion or that conclusion. Right? So, for example, in psychology, that sufficient reason is enough researchers have conducted quality research. Okay? But then the most important part, perhaps, is that conclusion is tentative. Right? You have to be prepared that somebody else might come along and produce new information that might cause you to have to change your mind. Two things about that. Number one, this is the part of the definition that should most remind you of the thinking like a scientist in your everyday life part that we talked about back in the beginning of the semester. The idea that when a scientist draws a conclusion, he or she has to be ready that somebody else might produce more evidence that would cause that conclusion to change. Second, the idea of skepticism, I think that differentiates what I said a few minutes ago from what some other people might say, but I don't think they actually mean it. Remember I said, I like to be right. Okay? Some other people might say that, but they don't really mean it. What they really mean is they like to think that they're right. That's importantly different. Right? For me, it's not enough to think that I'm right. I want to be right. And what that means is sometimes I have to change my mind. Because nobody is always right. Right? Despite what they might want you to think about them, nobody is always right. So if we want to be right, we have to realize we were wrong. That's skepticism. Okay? Third set of skills, of ideas here, you want to be able to identify these things, these biases, distortions, omissions, and assumptions. That is the purpose of the 7 tips that we're going to be covering for most of the rest of this lecture. I have a couple of other things to get to before then. But again, that's kind of the main point here. So, as we sort of transition into beginning to talk about the assignment itself and how you're going to do it, I want you to realize kind of where this came from. Right? So this whole Evaluate Psychological Claims project started with an observation that kind of makes me sad. Okay? It turns out that for most of you, this is the only psychology class that you'll ever take. And I wish that weren't true. I think psychology is a great subject. I think you should take tons of classes, but I have to face facts. At the College of DuPage, colleges and universities across the nation, most students, the large majority of students who take general psychology, they do not go on to take additional psychology classes. But, as I'm sure you realize, maybe the end of your formal education in psychology, it is by no means the end of your lifetime exposure to psychological information. Right? You're going to hear about it all the time, even just face-to-face talking to people as they make claims about human beings, and particularly when you see things in the media. Right? So these 3 claims that you see here are all ones that I have come across in the media over the last few years. Soy makes men aggressive, garlic can be used to control pain, flirting on the job is damaging to a woman's career. Okay? And the idea is that, obviously you realize this, you're not going to go around believing everything that you read about, hear about in the media. Okay? That doesn't seem very smart. But likewise, you're not going to go around disbelieving everything that you hear in the media. That seems equally unwise, right? Some of the things that the media are presenting are going to be correct. Some of the things are going to be incorrect. And we want to try and figure out, well, how do we know what to believe and what we should not believe? Okay? Turns out, you kind of already know the answer to this. And that is, you got to find the research, right? But think about that. You remember back in the beginning of the semester, I talked about sticking with your first impression and how that's a bad idea on when you're taking a multiple choice test. You should change your answer. Right, I told you that there were 60 individual studies, okay? That's not even a lot, right? There are some topics that have hundreds and hundreds of studies, okay? And it's not just reading those studies. You actually have to evaluate each one individually, right? So put them into a pile of studies that are well done, studies that are not so well done, and then look at the conclusions of each. Who has time to do that, right? But again, that's the way to do this if you want to be sure, right? You think, I don't have time for that. It'd be nice if I had a shortcut. That's what the 7 tips are for. They're to give you that shortcut that won't require you to read all that research. So, this actually might remind you of one of my favorite distinctions back from the judgment and decision-making module, System 1 and System 2. Right? Remember, favorite concepts, least favorite names, because it's hard to keep straight which one is which. System 2, detailed, logical, time-consuming, difficult way of forming a conclusion, forming a judgment. But if you do it, you're likely to get it right. Okay? So the first technique that I mentioned a minute ago, going and finding all the research, that's kind of like System 2. Okay? System 1, faster, easier, right? But the trade-off is you're less certain that you're going to be getting it right. And that's something to keep in mind here, right? If you really want to get it right, you're going to need to actually wade through some of the research in some cases. Here, I'm going to say, this is enough, this is going to get me close enough. Then I'm going to deal with the risk that I've drawn the wrong conclusion, because it's so much easier to just go through something like these 7 tips. So, we can now start with the tips. These are intended to roughly be in order of the way that you would do them. Okay, so one of the tips is going to take place right when you first encounter a website. Okay. So, for example, you might find marsvenus.com, website put out by a at this point family, father and son team of John Gray, no relation to me, and his daughter Lauren. If you're not familiar with John Gray, he actually has written maybe 15 books over the years. First one was 25, actually maybe close to 30 years ago now. And if you've never heard of it, maybe ask your parents if they're about my age, because when it was written, it was one of the most popular self-help books of all time. It's called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. Okay? And the idea is that men and women are so different from each other that we're not talking about different genders, we're not even talking about different species, we're talking about organisms from different parts of the solar system, just absolutely massive differences between men and women. Okay. So now, we're talking about what are your preconceived ideas, and this is a question about you, okay? Not so much about the material, it's what do you believe about that material. So you're going to come here and you're going to look around for a few minutes, maybe read a little bit about the about John Gray, look at some of the material that they have available for us. Right, so he offers, or they offer dating advice, relationship advice, kind of read around. We're not going to do that now because it would take too long. And then, after just a very, very short time, maybe 5 minutes, okay, you kind of get a rough idea. Then you're going to come back and you're going to think, all right, what do I currently believe about this? Okay. You might remember back in the beginning of the semester, the idea of the confirmation bias. The idea that we have a tendency to notice and pay attention to information that confirms what we already believe. This is kind of like a stronger version of the confirmation bias, because here we're being presented with information. If it's information that you already believe, we're very uncritical. We accept it. Okay? Well, what if this happens to be one of those times that you're wrong? Okay? So you have to be really, really careful when you're reading something that you agree with. Okay. So all you're going to do for this first tip, as you're doing the assignment, you're just going to write down. I have a tendency to believe that there are massive differences between men and women. Yeah, that's not what I would say. Actually, if it were me, I would say, as we'll see a little bit later today, I think that gender differences tend to be overgeneralized. They're not as big as people think that they are. Okay. So, tip number 2: who's the source? Who is it that's responsible for putting this website together? Okay. You do want to think about, what do fact checkers do? Fact checker is an actual job, right? And how do they proceed when they're trying to figure out if a website like this is legitimate? Okay. Let's point out, so many websites will give you this kind of about page, and right, so here I'm John Gray, author of Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. Let's see, proud to bring you the best resources, and so on. How can I help you? What do we got here? My mission: I'm here to help men and women create strong, passionate bonds, blah, blah, blah. And so on and so forth. What else? Press kit, anything useful in there? Oh, it's downloading it. I didn't actually want to see that. Yeah, now that I did it, let's take a look. Wow. Oh, here's his bio. Okay. Author of the most well-known and trusted relationship book of all time, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, top 10 most influential books of the last quarter century, #1 best-selling book of the 1990s, 20 books, okay. He's been on Oprah, Dr. Oz, etc. Happily married for 30 years. What else we got? Yeah, probably nothing else that I need to see here, because I'm actually already spending a little bit too long for this, because that's not what a fact checker does. What a fact checker does is they figure out who the person is, and then they leave. Then they leave and they do an independent investigation of who this person is, and that's what I want you to do. Okay. I wanted you to see a little bit of what he has up there so we can contrast that with actually the truth of this guy. Okay. John Gray has a PhD from a school called Columbia Pacific University. Columbia Pacific University was a degree mill. Right? If you're not familiar with the idea of a degree mill is a fake school. Right? Some degree mills are so bad that all you have to do is give them money and they will give you a degree. Columbia Pacific University wasn't that bad. You actually had to go there. But they were found to be awarding PhD degrees for undergraduate quality work. Okay? Undergraduate, 4 years. PhD, 6 years minimum after undergraduate. Columbia Pacific University was actually ordered by the state of California, the Board of Higher Education, to shut down. But it gets worse, because anybody who had received a degree from Columbia Pacific University from 1996 and later had to give their degree back. Okay? Now, John Gray went back in the 1980s. He claims that the school was very high quality then. No. It went back to 1996 because that's when the investigation started. That's when they started to collect evidence. Columbia Pacific University was always a degree mill. Okay? What else might you learn about John Gray if you trust not what he tells you, but what you can find out on your own? Back about 15 years ago, unfortunately this hasn't been done again because it was such a massive study, but some researchers actually did a survey of thousands of psychologists, practicing clinical and counseling psychologists in the United States. And really the study was just, they sent them a list of books and said, what do you think of these books? Dozens and dozens and dozens of self-help books. And John Gray's books came in dead last. People who do this for a living, they hate his books. He oversimplifies, he overgeneralizes, as we'll talk about later. He acts like these differences apply to all men and all women, and they are not helpful. Okay? So why did I show you his information first before I kind of tell you what you'd find out from an independent investigation? Actually, it turns out that research has shown that college students are really, really persuaded by this. This is pretty professionally produced. It's pretty well done. And when college students see stuff like this, they tend to automatically believe that it's legitimate. It's not, right? Not necessarily. Okay? For the purposes of this assignment, I'm not asking you to act like, a paid fact checker who would do hours and hours and hours of research. Just do a quick one, right? Feel free to use something like Wikipedia, and what you're looking for is, are there any controversies in this person's past that they're not likely to tell you about on their own website or in an article that they wrote. Okay. Wikipedia, always check with an instructor if they're going to let you use it or not. I think this is kind of what Wikipedia is for, right? This is not a scholarly paper that you're writing here. We're just trying to get a basic idea about something. Again, it's just a few minutes here and there. See if you can find something about both either the person responsible for the website, or sometimes you won't see the person, you'll see the organization. And so you can do a little Google search about the organization responsible for a website or an article. Okay. Realize, of course, if you can't get that information, who put the website up, what organization, what person, they failed. Right. If they're not even going to tell you who they are, that's a pretty big check mark against them. on the 7 tips. Tip number 3. Tip number 3 is going to seem pretty easy, and most of the time it is. So what's the purpose of the information? A lot of times, the purpose of a website, the purpose of an article is nothing more than to inform. But you want to kind of scratch the surface a little bit. Take a look. Maybe they're really trying to do something else. Maybe they're trying to persuade. Maybe they're trying to sell you something. As you will learn soon, it is actually a persuasion trick to disguise an effort to persuade, to disguise it as information. So just kind of look for some clues that there might be something more than just the provision of information. That's tip number 3. Tip number 4, this one will be very, very quick because this is something that you've probably heard me say 75 times. Right? Only reason you're allowed to say something is true. Somebody did the research. So if you are reading an article that's based on somebody's opinion, it doesn't matter that that person has a PhD. All right? It doesn't matter where their degree is from. What matters is what they're saying based on research. On a website, if this person is selling some self-help advice about how to save your relationship, like Dr. John Gray does, where's the research that shows that this information is correct? All right? If they don't have any reference page, so to speak, a section in that website or on that website that actually tells you about what research, what peer-reviewed research has been conducted, then how do you know that it's right? All right? Realize I'm not saying we know that it's wrong, but the only check we have on whether something is legitimate information is, did somebody do the research? And not just one somebody, lots of somebodies. I'm actually going to divide this lecture into 2 parts. I wanted to keep each individual one at 30 minutes or less. So I'm going to stop this here and then pick it up with tips 5, 6, and 7, which will probably take maybe another 30 minutes or so.